Sounds like it's on. All right. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Welcome to our third meeting of the advisory committee for the Gates Mills Comprehensive Plan. We are switching gears from our previous two meetings where the first two meetings were all about brainstorming, getting ideas, getting everything out on the table. And then, as you know, we had the town hall meeting, and we had a series of neighborhood meetings, and additional information was gathered. And so now we are pivoting to more detailed discussion in groups and then at the larger group to flush out the goals, objectives, and then to the extent there's strategies that you've identified, those as well. So what you will find at your table is CT's expansion of the goals and the edits to the vision statement and an expansion of the goals and objectives. And we did, through the town hall meeting, the neighborhood meetings, we did get some feedback on edits or expansions to the text in here. So those are included. And then we did take it to the next step, the next level of expanding, adding many more objectives. And so that's what you'll focus on when we do the breakout groups. But first, let me go through the agenda. So I'll do a short update on the meetings that took place in August. And then we have three guest speakers to my right. We have, not in the order you'll hear from them, but Steve Szymborski, related to our committee member Kelly. So welcome, Steve. And he's the treasurer for the village. And then we have Tony, and I'm sorry, Tony, your name, Pottigill. So he's going to talk about the schools. And then we have Bruce Rinker, who's a land use attorney with Mansor Gavin. And just to be transparent, I've known Bruce for a long time, but that shouldn't stand in the way. So thank you very much. And so with that, I will just go into the summary and update on the August meetings. But first, how many people were able to attend? Committee members were able to attend? Oh, good. Oh, good. All right. So one of the big things to point out is that total attendance with the town hall forum that was open to the entire community. And it really was a broad overview of the work that the committee has done so far. There were 76 people there. And then over the course of the next 2 weeks, with a lot of effort, thanks to a few people. And if you can stand, I see. Yeah, so if you were involved in organizing that, so Chuck and Russ, so if you could stand up and just be recognized for all of your work with Sandra and Chip organizing the neighborhood meetings. Thank you both. It was a lot of work. But you can see over the course of the 2 weeks, 285 people actually signed the sign-in sheet. So total of 361, but that's the number of people who were willing to tell us that they were there. So there were a number of other people from what I've heard who chose to be anonymous. We had a lot of anonymous people, which is okay. But we got a lot of good information and a lot of validation, I think, to both the survey and to what the committees have been talking about so far. Few things to point out, and these are just highlights of the material that was distributed last week. We got a lot of additional comments on the environmental issues, and just to recap that at our July meeting, that was the renewable energy topic was one of the topics that we hadn't yet discussed. So that we did receive a number of comments related to that. The septic system, more on the tree canopy and some additional issues related to flooding and light pollution, et cetera. And then composting and recycling. So that helps, I think, round out what we have in our environmental list of issues. In terms of land preservation, this was one of the questions that was suggested to be in the community survey, but at the end, when we were trying to pare things back because of concerns that the survey was so long, we did nix this one question. But as you can see, there is significant support, at least for those 82 people who let us know how they felt, but support for continued efforts on the part of the Gatesville's Land Conservancy or other entity to preserve land, to continue to preserve land in the village. In terms of land use and vacant land, we had a wide variety of comments that ranged from, as you can see the top bullet, more development in the village center or no, more retail. So that's one of the things that our village center group will wrestle with tonight. And then we had comments on cluster and other type of housing, issues related to young families, as well as senior housing and senior services. And then also there were people who people who are against any changes to the minimum 5-acre zoning. In terms of housing values, there were in the way this question was posed was, what do you think contributes to housing values? And one of the analyses that we had done was we had identified that in the village center, the small lots, that when you look at on a per acre basis, the small lots in the village center have a much higher value per acre than what is average for the rest of the village. And so the question was, what do you think contributes to housing value? So these are the broad topics that people had identified. When it comes to the challenges, there was a list of challenges that our group had already put together. And so you can see on the chart above what were highlighted as the top challenges, and what people in attendance and who participated in this exercise, they were asked to use the dots to identify their top 3 concerns / challenges. So you can see the utility concerns rose to the top, and I know we have had conversations among our group related to that, but it was interesting to see it was validated at the August meetings. So I know that's really fast. We can come back and talk about this when we do our discussion, but I did want to turn it over now then to our guest speakers, and Tony is first. You can do that.
Yes.
You have to tell me when to.
I will. All right. So good evening. So for those of you that may or may not recognize my last name, I was the former superintendent at West Geauga, retired in 2010. And I work for suburban schools across the state down in Columbus. It's my next career, and Mayfield's one of my clients. I'm a Mayfield grad, grew up in Mayfield Heights, worked in Gates Mills when I was a high school and college student, never got too far away and then ended up at West G. So pleasure to be here tonight. I am not going to spend a lot of time on school finance because we could be here into the wee hours of the morning and you probably would still be confused. So I'm going to give you the 50,000 foot level of two topics. And then the kind of the goal would be is if we need to take this to another level, I'm more than happy to come back. I've said this, Sandra, I'd be happy to come to as many meetings as you want, because the more you know and understand how schools operate, the more you understand on how to support the schools, no matter what district that you're in. And they have, just like the township in the community that you live in, they have just as many challenges as anybody else politically. So from the 50,000 square foot, there's going to go for two things. One is, so what's a school district, right? You're in a school district. That's number one. And the other is, okay, how are schools funded? Because you all pay property taxes. And so where does Mayfield kind of fit in that parameters of other communities and so forth? So we'll go to the first slide. So in the state of Ohio, I believe there are now 612 school districts. Constitutionally, they're set up. We have a state board, a state superintendent, and then these political units, which are school districts. Some very easily connect with the boundaries of their communities. Some cross over communities. For example, in West Geauga, I had a little piece of Chagrin Falls, but I had most of Russell, all of Chesterland, but I also had a little piece of Chardon. It's the historical connections of how those are drawn up. So Mayfield is considered what's called a city school district. And as you know, you're part of that district. It's also composed of Highland Heights, Mayfield Village, Mayfield City. So there are multiple communities that make up the Mayfield School District. Go to the next slide. So they're governed similarly like you're governed. They have a board. Most boards in the state of Ohio, with the exceptions of some urban schools, have 5 board members. They're elected from the conglomerate of whatever the district is. I don't think right now you have a school board member, right? I don't think there's a school board member from Gates Mills, but there could be a school board member from Gates Mills because you're in that district. You could have 5 just from Mayfield. It's just who runs for the school board. And the duties of the board are like any other political entity in Ohio. They meet. They only have powers when they meet. They make decisions about school policy. They make decisions about hiring. They make decisions about rules and regulations. They hire the superintendent, the treasurer. Those people are administrators. They manage the district. So that's probably not a revelation to everybody, but you're part of that. So every community in the state of Ohio is part of a school district, one of the 612 that are out there. You don't have an option to say, I don't want to be part. The Constitution says everybody is part. And wherever those drawings of the boundaries were historically, that's where you've been, and you've been in Mayfield as a group. So the next slide. So if you call these people and you say, where did you get my number or my email address? Please don't tell them I put it up on the board. But that's your board. These are your board members. Dr. Barnes is your school superintendent. So these are the people in charge of kind of managing Mayfield schools. And the one building that you have, Gates Mills Elementary, Bridgetown, is part of that system. All right, any questions? All right, now we get to the hard part. So school finance. Who understands school finance in here? Would like to understand school finance. So school districts collect tax dollars and revenues basically from 2 primary sources. Local collections, and it usually is through general property tax. There is some public utility personal property tax, and then income tax. You do not have an income tax for the schools. Some districts collect an income tax from the schools, but you do not. So primarily what you're paying is property tax to the district, and that's based on millage. Some millage is permanent. Some millage you vote in, you go to the ballot. Most of the millage collection with the exception of the ones that's permanent, once you voted in, cannot grow because of House Bill 920. So in districts like Mayfield, as well as West Geauga, as well as Chardon, as well as Orange, as well as Chagrin, the great majority of the funds coming to the district are coming from local property taxes. And I'll tell you why in a minute. The other place where we can get funding is from the state. So the state has a formula that is designed to steer money to districts based on their enrollment. And then it's governed by the wealth of that district. So the more wealth you have, the state believes the less they should send you and the more you should contribute locally. So those are the two big pieces of how, if we were showing you West G's budget, or if I was showing you Mayfield's budget, those are the large line items related to where they're getting their revenue. Next page. Again, the state that develops, we've created a thing called this base cost. So it's an inputs method. So they're trying to determine it costs $6,000 per student. So that isn't quite the number, but it's pretty close. You have 1,000 students, 6,000 times 1,000, that should be your number from the state. But the state doesn't determine, they don't give you the full 6,000 because they're going to look at your property wealth and your community income level. And based on that, they're going to give you a percentage of the full value. So say in Mayfield, say that percentage is 25%. In an urban setting, it might be 125%. Because if you go to the last, I think it's the last slide. So when you really start peeling away where districts differentiate themselves, so Mayfield's total tax property, when you do computations for millage, generates 342. There's a 342,404 per pupil. When you compare that to the county, that's greater than the county and significantly greater than the state average. So I have Cuyahoga County up. If I had a county in Southern Ohio, they'd be below the state average. So they're less wealthy than you are. So you're in the upper end of the wealth curve for property values. And if you look at median income and your average income, you are significantly still above the state average. So when the state computes your state share to add to your local share, you are getting less than the number because you're considered wealthy. If I threw the West G numbers up on the stage today, they're very similar. And when I would tell community members in West Geauga, guess what, folks, you're all wealthy. The state thinks you're wealthy. People go, well, wait a minute, I don't think I'm wealthy based on that. But based on your property wealth and your income level, there's more wealth as a value in Northeast Ohio than there would be in Southeast Ohio. So that drives the formula. And so in the end, what happens with schools like Mayfield, Willoughby, Chardon, West G, Orange, and Chagrin, the increase that we get from the state either is zero on the state level or very little. And as costs go up, that forces the districts to come back to their communities and ask for additional millage because it's the only way to raise additional revenue to cover cost. And that's the dilemma around school funding. That formula that they worked on just got fixed. We spent 6 years fixing the formula. It doesn't provide additional revenue for suburban districts like us because we're on the wrong side of the revenue on the wealth factor. So I only had 5 minutes. That gives you the 50,000 foot level. Any questions? So there's if you look at your property tax bill, that would be a good activity to do. There's different millages that are in there. The first 20 mills on your property are called inside mills. You always pay the full value on that 20 mil. When districts pass a levy above the 20 mil, there's two ways to do that. One is you make it permanent and then it adds on and it's an effective rate that goes up, or you make it an emergency. If it's an emergency levy, we did a lot of emergency levies in West Geauga, it generates a dollar amount. Say it's 10 million. 10 years from now, that levy, if that levy's still on the books, it's still generating $10 million. It's agnostic to your property value, whether you built new houses, everybody adds more into the number. On the permanent levies, it's very similar because of what's called House Bill 920, which was an inflation adjusting control on the growth of property taxes. So by and large, once you pass a levy and Mayfield's above the 20 mil floor, it starts falling in value as house value goes up. Their collections stay pretty close to the same until it hits the floor, and then it just collects at 20 mils of floor value. If it's an emergency levy, you'll see a renewal. If it's a permanent levy, it just added on to the tax duplicate. And there are pros and cons to doing both of those. You do a lot of renewals and you're always on the ballot doing renewals. Question.
Having a board member, what have you seen as those influential ways for community to get involved with?
Okay. Did everybody hear that question in the back? So what, outside of you electing a board member, right? And you're one of 5, and even then it's limitation because you're one of 5. You're not going to pass things. What's the best way to interface with your board? So my assumption is, because I had community groups that were represented with Russell and Chester community. My assumption is Mayfield has the same thing. You need to be represented in those groups. You are part of the district. You have an asset here. Just because right now it is what it is doesn't mean we'll always be what it is. So getting your input into the broader conversations of the district would be important. So understanding what those entry points are, right? Just like here, you've got this as an entry point to get information to the community. What does the school district have? So they have business advisory councils. That's certainly, I'm sure they have community councils. But you need to be there because you need to be part of those voices, just like Highland Heights is there or Mayfield Village. So that's what I would suggest. And because again, if you like one board member, that's great, but they may have an opinion and the other 4 have a different opinion. You may not get the change or influence that you want. You get a question?
Can a school district cross a county line? You mentioned that Chagrin Falls, part of Chagrin Falls is in the West Geauga. Is that part of Chagrin Falls, part of Cuyahoga County?
See, Chagrin Falls is very interesting because part of the district is in Geauga County and part of the district is in Cuyahoga County. The little piece I have ends up being, I think it may be Geauga County. But that was a historical line that was drawn, and it was drawn before there was even a street there. So I have a street, and I had a street. I talk about my district like I'm still there. We had a street in Chardon that half the street was West G on the back end, and the front end was Chardon. And it was just, they built that street after the line was drawn. So I just have to remind people when they moved on that street, they thought they were coming to West G, but they were on the wrong side of the street and they ended up going to Chardon. And they would argue that, no, our realtors said we're going to the district, but you have to really be careful because there are those anomalies that are out across the state. There aren't a lot of them, but that's usually what happens. That's why they've occurred that way, because they drew a line differently than would have been the political boundaries.
I read it correctly, in order for a village or entity to change a district, it's a constitutional change at the state level. Is that correct?
So the first question, I don't have that answer. So I wouldn't even try to figure that one. That would be the treasurer to say, because they have to pull out that. There is a Ohio revised code process that goes to the state board in terms of district boundaries. So there's actually a process that governs that. You asked me if it's constitutional. I don't know if it's constitutional, but I think it's Ohio revised code. And I can find that code, but that when districts change boundaries, then they have a process which they have to follow.
You had mentioned earlier that if there was a need to come back, you would be happy to go to you guys. And you want to keep our guest speakers.
The 5 minutes.
5 minutes. We're a little better.
But my last question in the back. So that answers the question up here about what that number is. So thank you. Pleasure being here. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be back again.
Good evening. We're going to talk about the village's finances to give the advisory group and others a working knowledge of where the sources of money comes from and what it's used for. Recognize that we've got a wide range of people on the committee or on the advisory group, from financial officers and CFOs to essentially people with just a working knowledge of budgets and finances. So this is meant to really just provide, again, a basic level of information. And as there are questions that come up, if we can't answer those today, we'll take them back, or specific questions and report back at the next advisory committee meeting. So page 1 here is quickly a sense of how big is the village? Where does the money come from? What's it used for? First of all, up in the top left-hand corner, this is the general fund. In government accounting, you're required to keep track of receipts and disbursements based on the purposes of those receipts and disbursements. Some of those are provided for by levies that are voted on. Some are provided by grants that are given to villages or other municipalities. Much of it comes to the village, though, as the general fund. But we do have close to 20 other funds, some very small, some very big, like the Capital Improvement Fund, that require money to be moved in and out for specific purposes. Also, on the government basis of accounting, this is really receipts and disbursements. Unlike corporate America, where it's based on revenue when you've earned something, or expenditures when you've committed to pay something, this is accounting here is when you actually do receive the money. It's recorded as a receipt, not before. And when you actually spend it, it's recorded as a disbursement, not before. So based on when money comes in and money goes out, it's not going to always be even, and it's not going to always be based on when that money was recognized. A little bit different than accrual accounting, which is essentially corporate accounting. Let's go back. What you have here is the 22 budget. The budget was put together last November and December by the Budget and Finance Committee, along with several subcommittees, wages, insurance, et cetera. We operate the village on what we essentially try to call a balanced budget mentality. Again, recognizing that we can't control every receipt and when it comes in and when every disbursement is paid, we nonetheless try to balance and live off of what we earn and spend to that level. We have roughly a $5.6 million budget of receipts, the same number roughly in terms of disbursements. Our receipts are primarily three sources. Real estate taxes at $2.4 million. And that number has been steady for the last 6 years. Doesn't vary by more than $40,000 to $50,000 a year. We'll show a chart that shows that it almost looks like a flat line. Income tax revenue, which is primarily income taxes that residents and villagers pay to the village. We don't have a lot of corporate income taxes. We don't have large corporations here that would pay income taxes. So most of this is income taxes coming out of the pockets of the people that work here. You'll see shortly how that number has grown the last 2 or 3 years and how we're benefiting from that. And then other revenue, which is roughly 19%. Other revenue is fines and costs. It's interest income, reimbursement from the county on a delayed 1-year basis for the materials for a road program, rental income from buildings that we own. A variety of sources, all of them add up to about $1.1 million. So the $6 million, the $5.6 million of receipt, 2.4, that's from real estate taxes coming out of essentially our wallets. 2.1 income taxes, was another 38%, and the final 19%, 1.1 million from these other miscellaneous sources. In terms of the disbursements, where does the money go? Primarily goes into five things. Number one, the biggest expenditure is the police force. We have $1.8 million, or 32% of our collected receipts dedicated to the police force. We have a full police force and all the equipment that's necessary. We do pay dispatch services on a regional basis with the other organizations down here in the county, but primarily our biggest expenditure is the police force. Fire and EMS is $600,000. That is another 11%. We have a volunteer fire department, as you know. We have a lot of individuals trained, both as volunteer firemen. All of our service department is trained in fire prevention and can and do work on fires when they're here during the workday or coming afterwards. We also have part-time volunteers that work on the fire side. We do contract out our EMS service to a local village. We don't have the ability to send a squad out. And as you'll see a little later, it's a rising cost with both the growth of the village a little bit and also the aging of our population. And frankly, the fact that we've got schools here and schools have accidents and sports and so on and so forth. That's a rising cost. It's about 11%. The service department, $1.7 million. That is everything to essentially run the village, the trucks, the snow plow, the cutting of the trees, essentially everything that would take to have the village operate from a service department standpoint. When that person was out last night at 3 a.m. after the wind and they found some trees that were cut this morning when you drove by at 7 o'clock, somebody was out this morning cutting trees in the middle of the night. And that's frankly our people. Administration, $750,000. That's the cost to run the village. Insurance, other kinds of costs that would take to essentially run a business. And the last piece, transfers, $750,000 going out. Again, the general fund receives substantially all the money unless it's specifically restricted by either a contract or by a levy, like the Land Conservancy or federal money from ARPA or from the CARES Act. All of the money comes essentially into the village's general fund. And it's up to the village general fund then to allocate out certain pieces for things that are needed. The biggest item is capital expenditures and capital improvements and the road program. So overall, we try to run the village at a balanced outlook. It's $5.5 million a year to run the village. We have had clean audits from the state of Ohio the last 2 years. What's nice about the village's funding sources, they're pretty predictable. We are very dependable in terms of real estate taxes and we're dependable to rising in terms of the municipal income taxes. And department controls are under tight controls. We had a very good set of budget meetings last fall, tightened up the budgets and all the departmental heads. They're responsible for running their departments to those levels. If they need additional funding, as they did this year for a few things, cost of gasoline, overtime, et cetera, they've got to come back to the finance committee, and then we have to go back to council and ask for additional appropriations. Next page, please. This is our real estate taxes. It's $2.4 million. It hasn't varied by more than $40,000 per year in any of the last 8 years. It's dependable and proven and sustainable and solid that way. Even with new homes that have been added the last several years, we might add 5, 6, 7 homes a year in the village out of the 900 that we have. It doesn't move the needle. So what is nice is we can count on that money and it hasn't gone down and it hasn't gone up, and it's going to be $2.4 million probably next year as well. Next page. Municipal income taxes are interesting. We've in the past averaged about $1,750,000 for a long time in terms of our municipal income taxes. You'll see that in the 2016, 2017, even 2018 kind of numbers. What's happened though in the last few years, there's two phenomenons. One is we have had the market has been good. The economy overall has been good. We had one very large receipt from one taxpayer in 20 and 21 that essentially contributed $2 million of income tax revenue to us from that one individual. That spiked the number up to over $4 million. So when you see the footnote there, number 2, that says, I've taken out of the chart that $2,750,000 because that's not going to recur. That was, again, based on a very unusual situation. The individual has since relocated. We're not going to plan on that number again. It is nice to have received it though. But what we do find in 21 is that we knew the number would be better than it had been in the past. We had picked $2.1 million as an estimate of what our income taxes would be. That number is already $2,450,000, and we're thinking it's going to be $2,500,000 this year. So we will be substantially, probably $400,000 over our budget. Rita has also advised us that that number can be relied on for the next 3 years. So that for 22, 23, and 24, we can probably count on $2.5 million of income taxes coming through Rita. Why is it happening? 2 things. Number 1, the work from home phenomenon or the shift has moved a lot of individuals paying their work city tax to the village of Gates Mills because they're now working in Gates Mills, even though they may have worked previously in Cleveland or any other municipality. We're now getting that piece of income. And secondly, on a more subtle basis, we're finding that individuals that maybe were retired or only had one income families are leaving the village, and they're being replaced in many cases by 2 income families or 2 wage earner families. We see that there are more tax returns being filed, and so we have essentially more wage earners than we had in the past. So from a municipal income tax standpoint, you can take a pencil and go from 2016 to 2023. It's an upward slope. There was a huge peak. We took the peak out, but generally we're upwards, and we're going to probably plan on about $2.5 million for this year and hopefully for the next 2 years. Next page. Departmental costs, in addition to the money we just talked about for police, fire, EMS, and service, you might say, well, what's that spent on? 51% of our expenditures go to our personnel. We have about 50 employees in the village. Obviously, they're not all full-time. We have a full-time police force. We have a full-time service department. We rely a lot on auxiliary and part-timers volunteer firemen when they, fire persons, when they do serve in that role, they are compensated for that. Auxiliary police that would come for the 4th of July parade or for other peaks and valleys of business. So we've got about 50 employees overall, and we pay obviously for all of their health insurance and their other benefits and their retirement. That is the biggest expense of the village. The second biggest one is operating costs. 20% of our overall costs are spent to operate the village. It's the gas for the trucks, it's the repairs for the trucks, it's the ammunition the police need, it's the vests for their protection. It's all the stuff to run a village. Dispatch is 3%. I put this out here, not that it's a big issue or big item, but people wonder, is that too expensive? And what are we doing with Chagrin Valley Dispatch? And can't we do it ourselves cheaper? It's not a big number. It's roughly 3% of the village's costs are spent in participating in the dispatch services of the police function. EMS, the same thing, 6%. EMS we're a little bit at a disadvantage there. There are not a lot of municipalities that are available to take on that service. We're under a 3-year contract right now with the current municipality to whom we outsource this. When that contract comes up, I would expect that they would want a higher rate given what's happened with inflation in the last 2 years. Capital expenditures, these are the police cars that we get every 3rd year, other kinds of trucks and equipment. This is not the roads program. This is the normal CapEx, about $400,000 a year to keep the police cars running and the equipment relatively fresh. And then the transfer is another 13%. I talked about that to fund other departments. So generally, I think the challenge we'll have going, we've seen a little bit of it this year, and we'll see it for this budget season when we start this fall. Inflation's going to cost us. We went into the budget this year anticipating some inflation, but that hopefully it would have peaked and have started to come down. That doesn't seem to be the case. We made compensation increases for our individuals last year, generally about 4%, except the police department, which we needed to be more competitive, and some of those salaries went up a little bit higher. I don't know that 4% will be good enough anymore. That may need to be a bigger number. We'll look at that this October, November, December when we start the budget process. Next page, please. So overall, the village is in good financial shape, as it says there. We operate with a balanced budget mentality. All the stuff that we do is fully transparent. It's all on the website. There's a written report that comes out every month. It's published. All the financial records are on the website. You're welcome to look at those. Send questions to either me, treasurer@gatesmillsvillage.com, or Janet, the clerk. Our revenue is based on dependable and or growing sources. So again, solid on the real estate taxes, growing on the municipal income taxes. Other sources always seem to add up to $1 million. We're generating positive cash flow. We have cash reserves in excess of 12 months of our operating costs. So we are in a nice liquid position, and the village has no debt. So if, as a result of some of the items that are going on through the advisory committee or the comprehensive plan, the village decides it needs to do something from an investment standpoint, we have a relatively strong balance sheet to work with. On the pinch me so I wake up in the morning side, we are not immune to the economic realities of inflation, the bear market, and supply chain disruptions. I mentioned briefly, we did take a look at our salaries. We do that across 8 comparable communities at all the different levels. Found that our police force, frankly, was lagging last year. Moved that up to a better number, and then all the other employees got about, I think, about an overall 4% increase. That may not be enough this year, given the realities of employment woes and such. We are dependent for two important services, dispatch services and EMS services that'll increase to over 10% of our budget. Again, it's not a killer, but it is something that we've got to be watchful for. Our broadband and cell phone coverage is at times spotty. There may be the need to invest in that. And then finally, the road program that we reviewed with council a meeting or two ago that calls for improving the roads over a 5 or 7 year period will cost the village between $750,000, maybe upwards of $1 million a year. That's to get all the roads in the village to a good condition, not perfect, just a good condition. So we do have some large investments coming down the road. That is it. So be happy to answer any questions on the slides. And if not, we'll answer them going forward as a result of your deliberations tonight. Yes, Karen.
Quick, simple, I think, question. How unique would it be if the municipality contributed to the broadband and cell coverage issues? Is that something that a municipality would do?
The municipality can do that. Yes. And it may be that to increase the coverage that we need for both broadband and cell, we probably will need to do that. You know, we're not a very desirable community for the service providers.
Got it.
You know,
Okay.
so for us to get better service, I'm not trying to get ahead of the broadband committee, which we have. We may need to, the village may need to invest in that in some way.
I didn't know that.
Yes, sir.
Aside from the road program, do you have an estimate of any other, or are there any other deferred maintenance costs, things that are not being done in order to keep the budget balanced that are going to be this sooner or later?
The only large other item could be broadband or cell coverage we just covered. The roads program, really, there's good maintenance on them, but you've got to just keep at it, given where we're at. We'll need a new fire truck in 5 years. That's going to be $750,000. The one we have is already 30 years old. Again, all these things are pretty well scheduled out and known. There's not a lot that's unknown. So I think as long as we keep it in front of us and plan for it, we should be able to handle it. Something like that will maybe pay out over 3 years or something. Yes. I didn't say it's not going to change no matter what we do. It's not a big, it's not a lever. It's not a big lever. You know, we have 900 homes here. We add 5, maybe no more than 10 a year, unless somebody wanted to add 100 homes, okay, and really increase the valuation or something. You know, adding 4 or 5 homes a year is not going to move the lever at the $1 million level. Janet.
Our levies stay at the amount that the property values that they were when they were originally approved. So every renewal, that's why your taxes don't increase. They stay at what they were when it was originally approved.
Yeah, pretty much so. I would say no matter what you do, you can do some things, as I said, but you know, that is not that's just not a big lever to improve the village's financial outlook. Yeah, Rob.
Could you remind us
of the total real estate taxes that are collected, how much, I think it's by percentage, ends up being revenue to the village that it can use? And maybe that ties into what Jerry was saying too.
I don't have that number. Janet, do we want to guess? Or do we want to?
Is it like 20%?
Total property taxes that are paid. I think the pie chart you're probably referring to is usually in the mayor's letter every year. The village retains about 15% of your total property taxes.
I was going to say 6. Dave?
The lever is, doesn't have. Because of that. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, thank you.
Well, good evening. No, I don't have a PowerPoint, but basically wanted to talk about, it was asked to talk about two components, being the lawyer in the house here. The first is, how does a comprehensive plan help protect the zoning scheme from any challenges? And then the other is your current conservation development, that's chapter 1160. To what extent does it or does it not protect and function well for the purposes for which it was implemented a number of years ago? Let me back up a little bit. My name is Bruce Rinker. Probably just about all my legal career, I've served in one way or another in public office of one kind or another. As a prosecutor, I worked in the Court of Appeals. I was a councilman in Mayfield Village for about 6 years, the mayor for 23 years. Currently, I'm one of 3 commissioners for the Cleveland Metro Parks. And yet I work in a firm where most of our clients are property owners, and yet we also represent governmental entities. So I kind of watch myself coming and going during the day and get lost. I think I have a pretty unique perspective on the pros and cons that you face on both sides of these issues that deal with land use. There's a real interesting dynamic, almost schizophrenic, in our country. For people who own property, they're all American. But when it's their next door neighbor, they become socialistic. Somehow someone else's use of the property is supposed to benefit the community, whereas my use of my property is supposed to benefit me. And that dynamic really doesn't go away. In our Constitution, and dating back to the founding, the idea of property ownership is really a fundamental right. Ohio, the Supreme Court of Ohio recognizes that, at least in phraseology. Very famous eminent domain case about 15 years ago, where the Supreme Court was very, very assertive in saying private property ownership is a fundamental constitutional right. It's guaranteed by the constitutions of the United States and Ohio, and any impact adverse to that right needs to be considered very seriously. Zoning laws are treated under the law as being in derogation of these private property rights. And so there's also case law in our Ohio Supreme Court that says these zoning regulations have to be construed strictly. We have to be looking favorably toward the property owner. And then you get this flip. Ohio recognizes home rule. Not all the states have this. This was a progressive movement back in the early 20th century. You're a home rule community. You have your own constitution, your charter, you have a council, you have a mayor. You have the right under Ohio law to promulgate zoning regulations for the benefit of this community. And there's some weird cases where the superintendent was talking about where the dividing line, a boundary line can lie. And there's case law, the effect that a property owner on this side of the line really has no standing to argue against somebody else's use on the other side of the line. And those rights will be protected. It's this disconnect that constantly keeps me in business, but really it confounds a lot of public officials, because on the one hand, you're trying to look out for the welfare of your community, and on the other hand, you have to deal with these individual property rights. The idea that you have vested rights. Ohio requires that if you have a zoning scheme at the time an application is made, that property owner has a right to proceed with the use of the property as it was zoned, regardless of any subsequent changes. And I'll give you an example. In Gates Mills, about 20 years plus years ago, you changed your zoning for the A1 single-family detached minimum lot size up to 5 acres, like Hunting Valley. Hunting Valley and Gates Mills, I think, are the only two communities in all of Cuyahoga County that have 5-acre zoning. In the broader context, that's viewed as exclusionary zoning. People who have exclusionary zoning don't like to lose it. And I know that Gates Mills is no exception to that rule. And in fact, Hunting Valley has the lowest population density in Cuyahoga County. Guess who's number 2? Gates Mills. And so you have to look at how you are going to justify maintaining an acreage number that in the scheme of things is exceptional. And Ohio doesn't help a whole lot. Definitions become really the watchword for all attorneys in their practice. And codes, zoning codes, very much depend on definitional language. Under Ohio law, the more you have standards by which public officials can regulate property rights, the clearer and more objective they are, the better. When they're fuzzy, when they're a bit loose, that becomes harder. They become much more subjective. And again, we find, Bridie, I know you see this too, when you go in front of boards and commissions, a lot of times what is good for the public, what those standards mean, more often than not is a subjective measure as opposed to an objective measure. A comprehensive plan, look for a definition, Ohio, you won't find it. But you talk about a zoning code, every zoning code is supposed to be promulgated in conjunction with, consistent with a comprehensive plan. So if this sounds like it's circular logic, that's pretty much what it is. You have on the one hand, venerating private property rights, but on the other, you have laws that give to public officials the power to regulate private property uses. And once a law is legislated under the law, the presumption is that it's reasonable, that it's there for good purpose. And anyone who wants to challenge, to upend that legislated law, because it's done through our democratic process, they have a very high burden. So there's this constant dynamic. You have a zoning code right now. In many respects, it's dated. And my understanding is what you're trying to do with this comprehensive plan, as you're looking at sort of the ethos of the community, the strategic planning going forward, you're trying to balance this dynamic between large lot zoning, keeping open spaces, and yet at the same time, finding ways to maintain a sustainable environment where you can bring in young people, take care of all generations, and also take care of the bottom line. So I think at the end of the day, when you talk about a comprehensive plan, it's something that's sort of conjunction with, complementary to your zoning code. Under Ohio law, the Ohio Supreme Court, when it's looked at guide plans or master plans or comprehensive plans, really looks at what are the data that you rely upon? What's the methodology you use? I mean, is it an honest assessment of the values that you're imputing into it? Because at the end of the day, a comprehensive plan reflects public opinion. And opinions, as we know, are, well, there are a lot of them out there. And under the law, the more objectively based an opinion can be, the better it is. A comprehensive plan is no different. When you adopt a comprehensive plan, you really have to think critically, is this something that passes muster? Because if someone's going to come and challenge it, we have to be able to rely upon it. If we incorporate it into our zoning code, that tends to fortify it, but it still comes back to what are the underlying public purposes that are supposed to be served. So a lot of times when we represent clients, the first thing we do is we look at the zoning code. We look at the comprehensive plan. We look at the definitional language. We look for what will be strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately, what are the objective measures that are used? And I'll give you an example. When you look at the Conservation Development chapter, and it refers to its purposes, it actually ties into another section of your code, which is chapter 1131, general provisions and definitions. So in other words, and it's in your subdivision section. So subdivisions in Gates Mills are supposed to adhere to certain principles, certain guidelines. So there's first a statement of findings. This is 113102. Commission and council find that significant portion of the lands in the village are comprised of exceedingly steep slopes, located in floodplains, contain soils which are unsuitable for septic systems. Only that's virtually all you have. And they lack a dependable supply of well water. Further, you're looking to preserve natural beauty and terrain, protect public health and safety by preventing erosion of soils, contamination of water, minimizing increased runoff of surface water and flood damage. And these are what anyone would see as legitimate, salutary public purposes. The harder question, though, to answer is, how do you effectuate them? And does your zoning code and does your comprehensive plan tied with your zoning code provide ways that connect that dot with these are the goals, are the regulations achieving those goals? And then I'll finish with this. When people challenge, typically property owners are challenging a community zoning scheme, there are two ways basically you do it. One is, it's called a facial challenge, constitutional challenge, where you're saying under any circumstance, standing alone, this legislation doesn't wash. It's not reasonable. It doesn't rationally effectuate legitimate public purposes. And then the other is, does the zoning code as applied to my property accomplish those ends? An as applied challenge, and I'll give you an example, one that's very famous in this area, happened a number of years ago in Moreland Hills. It's called Jalen versus Moreland Hills. Moreland Hills has 2 acre zoning, not 5, but 2. At least that's what was challenged. And the whole discussion all the way up to the Supreme Court was whether or not Moreland Hills could justify imposing a 2 acre minimum lot size against a property owner who had a development, was going to put in not just cluster development, but a high density development. The trade-off being that that development, infrastructure wise, was going to be very, very efficient. It would handle a lot of the stated goals of the Moreland Hills Code. But what it didn't do, it didn't deal with how it was changing habitat. It didn't deal with how it was changing the environment in the sense of ecosystems, the natural habitat for plants, for animals, not just an aesthetic, but there really was a biological basis. Now you have those standards stated in your code, but I think that part of the task in front of you should be to look at, as you're looking to either create new or adapt existing provisions through your comprehensive plan process, are you really achieving the ends that you're supposed to? Just next door in Bainbridge Township, Ketchel versus Bainbridge, seemed like a 3 acre pivot was very much at issue. You've got to justify 5 acres. You have public water, you're on septic, you have hillsides, you have ravines, you have natural areas. But at some point, you have to reconcile what your zoning code says and what your land use platting shows. Because if I understand correctly, some 75% of the residential zoning was zoned as the U1, the 5 acre minimum, probably averages around 2.5 to 3 acre minimum. If somebody wants to acquire those properties, pull them together and create some kind of cluster development, under your code, you still have to maintain a 1:5 ratio. Let's say I get 9 properties, they're all 2.8 acres. I should be able individually to build 9 properties because I have a buildable platted lot. It's non-conforming, but the law says I'm entitled to do it. If I want to come forward and create a cluster development with 9 units, and I achieve all the other goals that are set forth in your code, I think I know what the answer would be. Gates Mills officials would say, no way. Planning Commission would point to chapter 1160 and say, look, that's it. You get 5 units. The density has to remain that 1:5. If that goes to court, if there's a challenge, how do you address that challenge? And you may not worry about it, but all I'm saying is as time marches on and we see how the market pressures are going to develop, both Hunting Valley and Gates Mills are sort of like the last best place in Cuyahoga County. We see a lot of development going out into Lorain County. Sprawl is something that still exists very much today. But at some point, when you look at the pressures for development and you look at the pressures for maintaining the sustainable community environment you want, your budget, those kinds of factors are going to come into play. So I'll stop here. I just wanted to point out that you really are constantly facing, as again, this dynamic between individual property rights and the community right to regulate to advance public health, safety, and welfare goals. Question is are the regulations achieving those goals? Thanks. I don't know if you have any questions. Yes.
Yeah, I think, in the event, without advocating for, but just for discussion purposes, in the event, the comprehensive plan wanted to, in some way encourage or allow some other housing type, right? That didn't need the 5 acre zoning. Could that be expressed in a way in the comprehensive plan or ultimately in village zoning where, you know, either through some set of characteristics or designating specific locations, that could be done without changing zoning in the rest?
In other words, it doesn't set a precedent that's going to blow up the whole village.
Yeah.
The short answer is yes. How you do it, it's not just a political question and it's not just a legal question. This comes back to what I was saying. If there is a certain amount of science, a methodology, you're looking at data, because land is different throughout the village. What may be workable in the center of the village here would be something totally different. If you take Gilmore, for example, Gilmore decides to sell its property, or there's some other chunk of land, if the nursery is sold. Those are places where you have to ask that what if. But are there characteristics that are unique? Because I think that's how you distinguish it. You have to be able to identify plausibly, not pretext, but a plausible, rational basis. And once you do that, the law gives you that presumption of validity. It's getting to that point where you can identify that because there's zoning districts throughout communities everywhere. You just happen to have a certain pattern that's different than most.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, you know, but could you, like, is it like for sure it would throw it all into jeopardy, or could you define it, right?
No, I think you can define it. I don't think it throws it all into jeopardy.
Okay.
Part of the problem is that if you do nothing, you still have to consider where is a likely spot or locations where your existing zoning could come under attack.
Because there are very different parts of the village. I mean, you could define attributes about walkability or proximity to services and healthcare, right? And kind of
I think that's what you're all here for.
well, yeah, but I wanted folks, without getting into the details, I wanted folks to hear that there are ways to do it where you could accomplish those goals without throwing the whole, like, you know, without throwing lower density restrictions into question.
In principle, yes. In politics, it could be a different thing.
Well, politics is one thing, right?
Yeah, it's very much a real thing. But yeah, I think that's part of the task. And it's why you have community engagement, because you're pushing an envelope that a lot of people don't want you to push. But what is it that you want to accomplish? And I know that varies. I'm not sure you necessarily have consensus on that, but you try to be objective. Yes.
This is directed at you. I'm sure you don't know the answer, but if we're talking amongst ourselves about land use regulations and how strategically we're going to preserve our village, I think we need to get a sense from somebody in the village administration about what is the current strategy? How are we, when it comes to Gilmore developing their property, is there a different standard for them than there would be for somebody that's developing land along county line? And I'm not saying this just because I'm living next to Gilmore. I'm just wondering I have a hard time figuring out as a village, what our village strategy is for land use, for stormwater runoff maintenance, for light pollution, all these things. And I think we are not going to be able to come up with a fully developed master plan if we allow these gaps to remain. But we don't know what gaps there are until we hear from the village about how they are actually strategically enforcing the land use regulations we have right now.
Right.
So I'm wondering, and this is why you can't answer it.
Yeah,
how we get into
but I'll weigh into this extent, and maybe the Gilmore might be a good example, I don't know. In your code, when you look at your code, what are the values that are trying to be preserved? Typically, the visual that I get in my mind's eye is you're talking ravined areas, heavily wooded, wetlands, streams, habitat. They're environmental values, or they're just plain terrain issues that require special kind of attention. What do you do if you're in an upland area that's well drained, doesn't pose the same, it doesn't line up with the various values that have been incorporated into your code? Because if I'm a developer, first thing I'm going to look at is this the redheaded stepchild? Is this the odd man out? Is this the one that could be the exception to the rule? I think that's part of what you're trying to do, is if you catalog the land in your community, both as to physical terrain, use, relationship with other properties, those are the kinds of things that zoning codes try to address, and comprehensive plans as well. So part of this, I would suspect that your elected officials, and now I'm speaking from past experience, they like to get feedback from the community so they don't screw it up. It's a two-way dialogue. It really is. And sometimes if you are looking, you can bring to the table certain ways to benchmark and to improve that dialogue with your public officials. I think we're well over the time, so thank you.
All right, my question was not answered. How are we going to bring this in front of this group? If this has got to be part of our master plan, how do we bring what is going on right now and how do we fix it to this group?
I have to admit, I don't understand your question.
Don. So can you repeat your question? And when you direct it to the village and you say the village needs to respond on the strategies. So there are a number of ordinances in place, and so I'm not sure if you're implying that the village isn't enforcing them. I'm not sure I can answer your question, first of all. Second of all, I'm not quite sure I know what you're asking.
Very quickly, Gilmore Academy now has become an entertainment. Oops, thank you. Gilmore Academy has now become an entertainment complex. They brag about, just in the ice rink alone, they have 355,000 visitors a year. They have now added lights at the blessing of the village to their stadium, so that instead of having a nice afternoon game on a Saturday, not only do we have Friday night football games, but we have Thursday night soccer games, Wednesday night lacrosse games, blah, 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 blah. I can guarantee that if you look at our police blotter, Gilmore Academy probably has more police incidents than any other property in the village, simply because there are so many people using it and there isn't a lot of supervision there. So I say, how can Gilmore be allowed to use their land to become a for-profit entertainment facility when it's zoned single-family residence, and they should only be allowed to use it because they have an exception historically as a school? I will also add to that, 2 doors down from me, a property owner tore down a house, put in a private lake that fills basically the entire property, and then built up 15 to 20 foot tall, I don't know if they're levees or just fence or whatever. That is between Gilmore and that property, it's increasing the stormwater runoff that is coming into my neighbors. And then you add to that Gilmore, in the process of, I don't know what they're doing with their playing fields, but they had about 4 to 6 acres of wetlands on the eastern side of their property, they filled those all in. They filled them in with garbage, with construction materials, with porcelain, God knows what. So to the extent that we are worried as a village about stormwater runoff, one of our biggest property owners is daily impacting stormwater runoff. They are there was a new listing up there on people who are worried about light pollution. The village welcomed light pollution at Gilmore Academy. We are worried about keeping a pastoral, quiet environment for our neighborhoods. And yet what we're doing, in my mind, in the village, is encouraging Gilmore by simply ignoring what our regulations say to, by the day, increase their usage so that they have more revenue coming into the school for things that are not education related. So I'm just going to quickly say, my feeling is, if we're going to develop a master plan that says we're going to protect all these things and all these things are of value, that means nothing if we're not going to actually enforce the plan we claim we're going to. So what I'm asking is, because I can't figure it out at this point, what is the village strategy for protecting the pastoral nature of the village, protecting stormwater runoff and all these other environmental factors, if we aren't doing it via the land use enforcement we have now? And what is the goal going forward, and how are we going to do that?
So if I may respond to that, I will ask you to give us until the next meeting to find who at the village will be able to respond to your questions, because what you're asking is, from what I'm hearing you, is that there are laws on the books that you from your vantage point, it seems they are not being followed, not being enforced. And if that's the case, if the village doesn't have respect for its current regulations, why are we spending thousands of dollars and lots of man hours to put together a set of goals and strategies that may be all for naught? So Sandra, would you like to comment on that?
Let me just comment, because I think that's a fairly serious charge. Al, and as a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission for a number of years, I'm aware of some of the issues that have come before the Planning and Zoning Commission with regard to development and lighting, signage, et cetera, at Gilmore. And those issues were all addressed by Planning and Zoning. They're always, neighbors are always notified of the meetings and have an opportunity to come forward. So again, I think that's, a serious claim that, or charge that the village is not upholding its zoning. You brought up your own personal issue, and that has been discussed in the past. And I know currently there's materials being prepared for you, Al, to have another discussion with the, with the village. And we'll certainly have the mayor weigh in, the lead chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and our county engineer our village engineer, who have outlined responses to your concerns. So we have a difference of opinion here. And I think it's a significant issue that you raised, because if the village were not upholding those standards, it would raise concern about zoning changes. But I think that's the question, is that true or not? So I just wanted you to hear kind of another opinion or side to that claim.
So with that, I would like to take a break, and so that our distinguished guests are and not so distinguished. I don't know who wants to raise their hand on that. But I wanted to thank you all three for coming. We'll take a short break to give everyone, because as the agenda says, we're here till at least 8:45. Oh, that was a typo, but but anyways, give you a few minutes to get up, stretch, and then come back and dive into the discussion. But again, if we could have a round of applause for our experts at the table. Thank you very much.
Wonder what our house. We serve on this group in anonymity.
All right, everyone, we're, if you can take your seats, we're gonna get started so that we, aren't here until 8:45.
Did Rob leave? That's too bad.
Okay, so we're going to move into what we've labeled our breakout discussion. So you are each at a table that's going to be topic specific. And depending on how robust the discussions are, we will go a half an hour, 45 minutes or so among the groups, and then do a report out. So the two topics are the future of the village center, and the second topic is housing / attracting new, keeping existing residents. So you have some, you have 4 of the medium-sized maps. They're the same map. So the idea was that you could share among yourselves at the table using the map as a reference. And well, it's all up to you. The idea is, the expectation was we would go until about 8:30. That's what, on the calendar. Right. So I would suggest that we go through and we go through the discussion. And then at the end of the discussion, we identify opportunity sites and if there's additional information that we need. And then we can pick it up at the next meeting so that we can end around 8:30. Okay, so the other piece of information I'd like to point out is you also have, and everyone should have a copy, you also have the updated goals and objectives that shows the changes that we made using the track changes with the red strike through as a word that we're deleting, and then the red underline is the expansion of primarily the objectives, and then getting into some in cases where they were presented some more detailed strategies. So the objective of this discussion, if we weren't so far off of our timeline, the objective was to understand and have an idea of what else needs to be on these lists. But I think what's most important is looking at the maps, because both of these topics do have implications on specific areas of the village. Obviously, the village center is place oriented. And then, so ideas on opportunity sites. And then the second is what other data, what other information do you need to advance the discussion in terms of the vision, the goals, and the objectives, and reaching some agreement on what those drafts, goals and objectives and strategies should be. Are there any questions? I mean, look, a lot of puzzled looks.
I'm just not sure exactly what we're supposed to.
So the first thing would be to look at, and I know you're just getting this for the first time. Yes. So the goals, they're the 7 goals that were identified and distributed at the last meeting. So the number of goals and pretty much the major description of each goal has remained the same with just a few tweaks here and there. the areas of discussion tonight are the housing opportunities and how do we attract and retain residents. The second topic is the village center. So the goals there. So, right, right. So for the housing group, number 4, goal number 4 mostly focuses on housing. There are other support services that have been brought up in terms of senior citizens and doing aging in place and providing services like that. And so those are in the, I believe it's number 6 that talks about services. So what I would suggest is that you go through, somebody read these out loud. And if each table can pick a table leader who would be willing to,
That was gonna be.
where'd he go? Okay.
He's not coming back.
Yes, we need a note taker for each table, and we need someone who wants to be the table leader to keep us all on track. And Sarah and I will sit, Sarah at the housing table, and I'll sit at the, yeah, okay,
Supposed to read this.
at the village center. So for the village center, that is not, you're not so succinct. The, you do have some areas, some additions under number 3, the community pride and engagement.
So
And so the map for the village center gives you this, the area that, I mean, it's broader than what you would now call the village center, but it extends north to the nursery. Some people have talked about how that's within walking distance, and so if there were new housing sites, new housing proposed, that might be close enough to create some neighborhood feel. And so then it expands, or it shows you far enough south of the polo fields. So again, if somebody would,
I'm still not clear.
No.
I don't get it. Are we supposed to read these and then agree with them, or?
what I'm saying is, so that's the village center area. From our vantage point, we're giving you a map that goes as far south as
I can't hear you.
where those 2 streets intersect, so that you see all of the where the Hunt Club is and the polo field, et cetera. And it goes as far north as the nursery. Not that you need to talk about the nursery. Yep.
Waste our opinions about these issues out there, but to synthesize what we've heard and.
So let me answer that for both tables. So the question was raised, what is the role, what is each of your roles in this discussion? Are you representing your own vantage point, your own perspective, and your own opinion, or are you representing the thoughts and the concerns and the comments that you've heard? It's both. It's both, because you represent other people who there are other people who feel like you, but you've also heard from a wider range of people. So what we're asking you to do is keep both perspectives in mind and weigh in on, based on everything you've heard so far, what's missing from the goals and objectives that relate to your topic, and what other information, and are there opportunity sites? So from the housing standpoint, we have these red outlines, identify parcels that have been identified as potential housing areas. And so one of the conversations, one of the pieces of information that you received was related to cluster housing, the current conservation district and the options that are provided through that. And to think about For example, Bruce Rinker talked about the current conservation district, conservation development district. This site up here is the largest site in the village. It's 140 or so acres. So there's development potential there. Yes. Yes.
The idea that this could be a PDF ahead of time, we couldn't do it, but it's thoughtful.
All right, before everyone goes home and has something good to drink, make it through the rest of the night. I did want to say, we really appreciate your patience. I know we threw a lot of information at you, and I know we didn't give you any time tonight to read all the red line lettering. My apologies on that. I do, again, want to reiterate that if you have any questions, any requests for information, send those to CT, Sarah and myself, and we'll compile that. We've also committed to sending out an email tomorrow that gives you a short synopsis of our next 3 dates through the end of the year, and followed up with the 3 different calendar invites. At the next meeting, we'll reconvene with our same groups and continue the conversation on from there. Again, thank you all very much for coming. All right, good night.